Call someone else. Those 3 words changed the way I looked at my daughter forever. Ashley didn't sound angry. She didn't sound upset. She sounded inconvenienced. As if I were interrupting her day instead of calling her from a hospital recovery room just hours after surgery. I stared at my phone, waiting for her to say something else. Maybe she would laugh and tell me she was joking. Maybe she would say she was already on her way. Instead, there was only silence before the line disconnected. I'm Margaret Whitmore. I'm 72 years old, and that morning I had undergone knee replacement surgery at a hospital just outside Portland, Oregon. The procedure had gone well, according to the doctors. They expected me to recover fully. But as I sat alone in that small room overlooking a gray November sky, I realized that healing and recovery were not always the same thing. For months, Ashley had promised she would be there. She had attended appointments with me. She had helped me choose a rehabilitation center. She had reassured me every step of the way. "Don't worry, Mom," she kept saying. "I've got everything covered." Those words replayed in my head as I stared at the blank screen of my phone. The nurse stopped by and asked if my ride was coming soon. I forced a smile and told her there had been a delay. It sounded less humiliating than the truth. Outside my window, rain tapped softly against the glass. Inside, the room felt too quiet, too empty. I checked my phone again. No text. No missed call. Nothing. Part of me wanted to make excuses for Ashley. Maybe something important had happened. Maybe there was an emergency. Maybe she really was busy. But deep down, a different voice whispered something I had spent years trying not to hear. Maybe she simply didn't want to come. The thought settled heavily in my chest. Looking back, there had been signs. Missed birthdays. Canceled lunches. Holidays shortened by excuses. Little disappointments I had always brushed aside because mothers are experts at forgiveness. We tell ourselves our children are stressed. We tell ourselves life gets busy. We tell ourselves love is still there, even when it stops showing up. Another 20 minutes passed. Then 30. I watched people come and go through the hallway outside my door. Families arrived carrying flowers and balloons. Husbands helped wives into wheelchairs. Sons carried overnight bags for their fathers. Everyone seemed to belong to someone. Everyone except me. I lowered my eyes and folded my hands in my lap. For the first time all day, I allowed myself to wonder what would happen if nobody came at all. Then there was a knock at the door. Not the quick knock of a nurse. Not the hurried knock of a doctor. A slow, deliberate knock. Before I could answer, the door opened. A tall, gray-haired man stepped inside, carrying a bouquet of white lilies. He looked directly at me and smiled. "Margaret Whitmore," he said quietly. "I've been looking for you for a very long time." For a moment, I wondered if the medication was affecting my memory. The man standing in my hospital room looked familiar in a distant way, like a face from an old photograph tucked inside a drawer and forgotten for decades. He was probably in his late 60s, dressed in a dark blue jacket, holding the lilies carefully as though they carried something fragile besides flowers. I searched his face and found nothing I could place. "I am sorry," I said quietly. "Have we met before?" His smile widened, but there was sadness behind it. "Not in a very long time." He stepped closer and set the bouquet on the small table beside my bed. "My name is Ethan Carter." The name meant nothing to me, at least not immediately. He seemed to notice my confusion and nodded. "That is all right. I did not expect you to remember right away." Before I could respond, a nurse entered to check my blood pressure. Ethan stepped aside politely and waited. While she worked, I noticed something unusual. He was not looking around the room. He was not checking his phone. He was not impatient. His attention remained fixed on me, as though seeing me mattered. It had been a long time since anyone looked at me that way. After the nurse left, silence settled between us. Rain continued tapping softly against the window. Finally, Ethan pulled a chair closer and sat down. "You probably have a lot of questions," he said. I almost laughed. That would be an understatement. He folded his hands. "Then perhaps I should start by explaining why I am here instead of your family." The words landed gently, but they still hurt. My eyes drifted toward my phone lying face down beside me. No messages. No calls. Ashley still had not contacted me. I turned the screen over and placed it out of sight. "How do you know about my family?" I asked. Ethan hesitated. "Because I have been trying to find you for years." He reached into his jacket pocket and removed a worn envelope. The edges were faded and creased with age. Carefully, he handed it to me. My name was written across the front in handwriting I did not recognize. "Margaret Whitmore." I traced the letters with my fingertips. "What is this?" I asked. A letter I should have delivered decades ago. My heartbeat quickened. Nothing about this day was unfolding the way I expected. I had arrived that morning focused on surgery and recovery. Now I was sitting beside a stranger carrying pieces of my past. Ethan leaned back slightly. "Before you read it, there is something you need to know. 40 years ago, when I was struggling to stay in medical school, someone changed my life." I looked at him carefully. Something flickered at the edge of my memory. Not a face, not a name, a feeling, a small apartment, a young man studying late into the night, a stack of textbooks on a kitchen table. The image vanished as quickly as it appeared. Ethan noticed my expression. "You are starting to remember." I swallowed hard. Outside, the rain grew heavier. Inside, a strange certainty began settling over me. The man sitting across from me had not arrived by accident. Somehow, in a moment when my own daughter could not be bothered to answer a call, a forgotten chapter of my life had come back and knocked on my door. My hands trembled slightly as I turned the envelope over. The paper felt old, fragile, as though it had traveled through decades just to reach me. Ethan remained silent while I carefully opened it. Inside was a single folded letter. The handwriting was neat but unmistakably written by someone much younger than the man sitting across from me now. I began reading. The first few lines were enough to pull me backward in time. Suddenly I could see that small apartment again. I could smell coffee brewing in the kitchen before sunrise. I could hear the sound of textbooks opening and closing late into the night. 40 years earlier, after my husband Daniel and I bought our first duplex in Portland, we rented the upstairs unit to a struggling medical student named Ethan Carter. Back then he was 28 years old, working 2 jobs while attending classes. He could barely afford groceries. Some months he paid rent late. Other months he tried to hide how difficult things had become. I remembered finding him one winter evening sitting on the back steps in a thin jacket while freezing rain fell around him. I had invited him inside for dinner. After that, it became a routine. Whenever I cooked extra food, I carried a plate upstairs. Whenever he looked exhausted, Daniel would tell him to take a break and join us for coffee. Little by little, Ethan became part of our lives. As the memories returned, I felt something tighten in my chest. Not sadness, recognition. I looked up from the letter. "You were the student." Ethan smiled softly. "Yes." The room seemed quieter than before. I glanced back down at the page. The letter described things I had completely forgotten. A semester when his financial aid fell through. The night Daniel repaired his car free of charge so he could get to clinical rotations. The check I quietly slipped into an envelope to help cover tuition after learning he was considering dropping out. To me, those moments had never felt extraordinary. They were simply things people did when someone needed help. But reading Ethan's words, I realized he had carried every one of those memories with him. "I cannot believe you kept this," I whispered. "I kept everything," he replied. He reached into his jacket and produced an old photograph. There we were, Daniel standing beside me in front of the duplex. Ethan stood between us, much thinner, much younger, smiling with the confidence of someone whose future was finally beginning. My eyes filled with tears. Daniel had been gone for 8 years. Seeing his face unexpectedly felt like receiving a gift. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Margaret, there is another reason I wanted to find you." Something in his tone made me lower the photograph. "What do you mean?" He hesitated carefully, choosing his words. "Over the years, I tried reaching out. I sent letters, holiday cards, a few phone messages when I could find a number. Confusion washed over me. I never received any of them." Ethan nodded slowly as though he had expected that answer. "That is what I eventually began to suspect." A chill moved through me despite the warmth of the room. "Why?" I asked. Ethan looked toward the rain-covered window before meeting my eyes again. "Because every time I tried contacting you, someone always answered on your behalf. And that person made it very clear that you were not interested in hearing from old friends." My stomach tightened. There was only one person who regularly handled my calls, my mail, and many of the details of my life. For the first time that day, a question surfaced that I was not sure I wanted answered. What if the distance growing between me and the rest of the world had not happened by accident? The question lingered in the room long after neither of us spoke. Ethan did not rush to answer. He seemed to understand that some realizations needed space before they could be faced. I looked down at the photograph again. Daniel's smile. My younger face. A simpler time. Back then, our front door was rarely locked. Friends stopped by unannounced. Neighbors shared coffee across kitchen tables. Life felt connected. Somewhere along the way, that connection had quietly disappeared. I had blamed age. I had blamed distance. I had blamed busy schedules and changing times. Now I was beginning to wonder if I had been blaming the wrong things. Ethan finally broke the silence. The first letter came back unopened. The second never received a response. After that, whenever I called, the same woman answered. I already knew who he meant. My stomach tightened further. Ashley had been helping me manage things for years. At first it seemed thoughtful. She organized paperwork after Daniel passed away. She helped update contact information. She offered to sort mail when I traveled. Little things. Helpful things. Things a loving daughter would naturally do. What did she say? I asked quietly. Ethan looked uncomfortable. She said you were overwhelmed and preferred not to reconnect with people from your past. I stared at him. The explanation sounded reasonable. It sounded exactly like something I would have believed if someone had told me. That was what made it so disturbing. It was believable. Ethan continued carefully. A few years later I tried again. She told me your health was declining and that outside contact only caused stress. I let out a slow breath. The room suddenly felt smaller. Memories began surfacing one after another. Invitations that never reached me. Friends who stopped calling. Christmas cards that slowly disappeared. People I had once known well seemed to fade away without explanation. At the time I assumed life had simply moved on. Now those missing pieces were beginning to fit together. I remembered asking Ashley once why my old friend Carol had stopped writing. Ashley told me Carol had moved overseas. A year later, I learned from another acquaintance that Carol still lived 20 miles away. When I questioned Ashley, she laughed and claimed she must have confused her with someone else. I remembered a church luncheon I never attended because Ashley told me it had been canceled. Weeks later, I saw photographs online. The event had happened exactly as planned. Again, there was an explanation. Again, I accepted it. Looking back, there always seemed to be an explanation. That was the problem. Each incident alone felt insignificant. Together, they formed a pattern I had never wanted to see. Ethan studied my expression. Margaret, I am not trying to hurt you. I know, I replied. And strangely, I did know. There was no judgment in his voice. No satisfaction. Only concern. The kind of concern I had not felt from many people recently. My phone suddenly vibrated on the bedside table. My heart jumped. For one hopeful second, I thought it might be Ashley. Perhaps she was calling to apologize. Perhaps there had been a misunderstanding. I picked up the phone. The message was from a pharmacy confirming a prescription pickup. Nothing more. I placed it back down and stared at the dark screen. Ethan noticed, but said nothing. That silence told me more than words could have. He did not need to convince me of anything. The evidence was already sitting in my lap. Outside, the rain had finally begun to ease. Pale afternoon light filtered through the clouds. For the first time all day, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger. Not yet. Clarity. A small but undeniable clarity. And once a person begins seeing clearly, it becomes impossible to look away. The next morning I was discharged from the hospital. Ethan arrived before sunrise carrying 2 cups of coffee and a folder filled with recovery instructions that he had already reviewed with my care team. He moved through the process calmly, efficiently, as though helping me was the most natural thing in the world. As we slowly made our way toward the parking garage, I found myself wondering how many years had passed since someone had shown up for me without being asked twice. The drive home was quiet. Oregon's evergreens blurred past the window while low clouds hung over the hills. My knee ached, but my thoughts were elsewhere. Every mile seemed to carry me further away from the version of reality I had believed for so long. When we reached my house, Ethan carried my overnight bag inside and stopped abruptly in the living room. "Something is wrong," he said. I looked around. At first, everything appeared normal. The same beige sofa, the same framed photographs, the same grandfather clock Daniel had restored years ago. Then I noticed it. Several family photographs were missing. Empty spaces remained on shelves where frames once stood. "That is strange," I said. Ethan glanced toward me. "Did you remove them?" I shook my head. The last time I had been in that room before surgery, the shelves had been full. Slowly I moved closer. More than photographs were missing. A small wooden box Daniel had built. A collection of greeting cards from old friends. Even a few address books I had kept for decades. A feeling of unease settled over me. I reached for my phone and called Ashley. The call went straight to voicemail. I tried again. The same result. Ethan said nothing while I stood there staring at the screen. Later that afternoon, while I rested in a recliner, he helped organize some paperwork from a cabinet near my desk. That was when another surprise surfaced. Several unopened envelopes had been pushed behind old tax records. They were addressed to me. Some were only months old. Others were years old. Confused, I opened the first one. It was a Christmas card from Carol, my longtime friend. The second contained an invitation to a retirement party I had never known about. The third was a handwritten note asking if I would like to reconnect over lunch. My hands began shaking. One by one, I opened more. There were birthday cards, reunion invitations, letters, messages from people I had assumed forgot me, people who had actually been reaching out all along. Ethan watched quietly as the pile grew larger. I felt as though I were uncovering pieces of my own life hidden beneath layers of dust. How could this happen? I whispered. Nobody answered because deep down I already knew the question was changing. It was no longer how. It was who. That evening, as rain tapped gently against the windows, my phone finally rang. Ashley's name appeared on the screen. For a brief moment, I felt the familiar rush of relief. The instinct every parent knows. The desire to believe the best. I answered immediately. "Mom," she said. "I heard you were home. Is everything taken care of?" I looked across the room at Ethan, who was carefully sorting the recovered letters into neat stacks. Then I looked down at the decades of forgotten connections spread across my coffee table. For the first time, I noticed something missing from Ashley's voice. Concern. She had not asked how surgery went. She had not asked if I was in pain. She had not asked if I needed anything. Her first question was whether everything had been handled. And suddenly those words felt far more important than she realized. For a few seconds I said nothing. Ashley filled the silence herself. She always had a talent for doing that. "I was going to call earlier," she said quickly. "Things have just been incredibly busy over here." I looked around my living room. The missing photographs, the hidden letters, the stacks of unopened cards from people who had never actually abandoned me. Busy. It was the same explanation she had used for years. The same explanation I had accepted for years. "The surgery went well," I said calmly. "Thank you for asking." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Ashley had not asked. We both knew it. "Of course it did," she replied with an awkward laugh. "I knew everything would be fine." Everything. That word stayed with me. Not my recovery. Not my health. Everything. Behind me, Ethan quietly stood and carried the letters into another room, giving me privacy. The gesture struck me because it reflected something I had not experienced in a long time. Respect. Ashley continued speaking. She told me about work. She told me about traffic. She told me about a neighbor's new dog. Nearly 10 minutes passed before she finally asked the question she had really called to ask. "By the way, who picked you up from the hospital?" There it was. I stared out the window at the wet Oregon sky. "An old friend." Another pause. Longer this time. "What old friend?" she asked. Her voice sounded sharper now. Interested. Alert. Someone from many years ago. I kept my answers short. For once, I found myself listening instead of explaining. Ashley did not know what to do with that. Eventually, she ended the call, promising to visit sometime later in the week. When the line disconnected, I felt strangely calm. Not relieved. Not angry. Simply calm. It was the feeling that comes when a puzzle finally begins revealing its picture. Over the next few days, my recovery progressed steadily. Physical therapy was uncomfortable, but manageable. Ethan checked in every morning. Sometimes he brought groceries. Sometimes coffee. Sometimes nothing more than conversation. The more time we spent talking, the more memories returned. Stories about Daniel. Stories about our old duplex. Stories about people I had not thought about in decades. One afternoon, Ethan arrived carrying a small storage box. "I found something else," he said. Inside were copies of letters he had sent me over the years. Some dated back more than a decade. Every envelope carried my correct address. Every letter had somehow failed to reach my hands. I carefully read each one. Holiday greetings. Updates about his medical career. Notes thanking me again for kindnesses I barely remembered giving. One letter mentioned that he had tried calling several times, but had been told I no longer wished to maintain contact with anyone from my past. I lowered the paper slowly. Ashley said that. Ethan nodded. I never wanted to believe it. That is why I kept trying. The room fell silent. My eyes drifted toward a framed photograph of Ashley as a little girl sitting on Daniel's shoulders at the county fair. She could not have been older than 7. She looked so happy, so innocent. I searched that smiling face for answers that no longer existed. Somewhere between that little girl and the woman she became, something had changed. Or perhaps the change had happened so gradually that I never allowed myself to see it. Then another realization settled over me. The missing letters were not the real loss. The lost years were. The lunches never shared. The friendships never renewed. The conversations that never happened. Time had been quietly taken from me, one unopened envelope at a time. And for the first time in my life, I stopped asking whether Ashley meant well. Instead, I began asking a far more important question. Why had she worked so hard to keep me alone? The question stayed with me long after the house grew quiet each evening. Why had Ashley worked so hard to keep me isolated? A week earlier, I would have dismissed the thought as unfair. I would have defended her. I would have searched for innocent explanations. But recovery has a strange way of slowing life down. With fewer distractions, patterns become harder to ignore. Every morning, I sat near the living room window with a cup of coffee and another stack of old letters. One by one, I called people I had not spoken to in years. The conversations were awkward at first. Then something remarkable happened. Every single person sounded happy to hear from me. Carol cried when she recognized my voice. Another friend told me she had assumed I no longer wanted contact because several invitations had gone unanswered. A former neighbor said he had sent Christmas cards every year until they started coming back without response. Story after story sounded painfully familiar. Nobody had abandoned me. They had simply stopped knocking on a door that never seemed to open. The realization hurt, but it also brought unexpected comfort. My world had not become smaller because people stopped caring. My world had become smaller because someone had quietly built walls around it. One afternoon, Ethan helped me organize a cabinet in my study. Behind a row of binders, we found another collection of documents. Most were ordinary. Insurance forms, utility statements, medical paperwork. Then I noticed something unusual. Several forms listed Ashley as the primary contact for nearly everything. Emergency notifications, appointment reminders, community organizations, even social groups I barely remembered joining. It was as though my entire life had gradually been redirected through a single person. I sat back in my chair and stared at the papers. Did you know about all of this? Ethan asked gently. I shook my head. Not really. The truth was more complicated. I had signed many forms over the years. After Daniel died, I was overwhelmed. Ashley offered help. I trusted her. Each signature seemed harmless. Each decision felt practical. Looking back, I realized how easy it is to surrender small pieces of independence without noticing. Nobody wakes up one morning and hands over control of their life. It happens one helpful suggestion at a time. That evening, Ashley finally visited. She arrived carrying flowers and wearing an expression that seemed carefully prepared. As soon as she stepped inside, her eyes moved across the room. The recovered photographs were back on the shelves. The letters were neatly organized on the coffee table. Several framed pictures of old friends now stood beside family portraits. For the briefest moment, I saw surprise cross her face. Then it vanished. The house looks different, she said. I have been doing some organizing, I replied. She nodded slowly. Her gaze shifted toward Ethan, who was washing coffee mugs in the kitchen. The atmosphere changed immediately. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. He is still here? She asked. He has been helping me. Ashley forced a smile. That is nice. But her voice sounded tight. Throughout the visit, she asked questions that seemed ordinary on the surface. Had I paid certain bills? Was my physical therapy scheduled? Had anyone contacted me recently? Who had I spoken with? Each question felt less like concern and more like inventory. For years, I would have answered automatically. This time, I simply smiled and changed the subject. The difference unsettled her. I could see it. When she finally left, I watched her car disappear down the street. Then I closed the front door and stood quietly in the hallway. Something had changed inside me. I was no longer waiting for Ashley to choose me. I was no longer measuring my worth by how often she called or visited. For the first time in years, I was building a life that did not depend on her approval. And somewhere deep inside, I sensed that Ashley had begun to notice it too. Over the following week, small changes continued spreading through my life, like sunlight reaching corners of a room that had been dark for years. Friends called. Neighbors stopped by. Carol brought homemade soup and stayed for 2 hours talking about memories we both thought had been lost forever. My calendar, once nearly empty, slowly filled with coffee invitations, church events, and lunch plans for when my recovery improved. It was not dramatic. It was not sudden, but it was real. And the more connected I became, the more uneasy Ashley seemed. Her calls grew more frequent. Her questions became more specific. One afternoon, she arrived unexpectedly while Ethan and I were sorting old photographs at the dining room table. She barely glanced at the pictures before asking whether I had met with my financial advisor recently. The question felt strangely abrupt. Not lately, I replied. Ashley nodded too quickly. You probably should, just to keep everything organized. I watched her carefully. Years ago, I would have interpreted the comment as concern. Now I listened. Differently. I noticed how often our conversations drifted toward practical matters. Bills, accounts, property taxes, insurance paperwork. Subjects that always seemed to interest her more than my health or happiness. A few days later, another piece of the puzzle appeared. My attorney, Harold Simmons, called to check on my recovery. Harold had handled Daniel's estate years earlier and remained someone I trusted. During our conversation, he casually mentioned receiving several inquiries from Ashley over the past year regarding my estate planning documents. The statement caught me off guard. What kind of inquiries? I asked. Harold hesitated. Mostly questions about whether any updates had been made. A strange silence followed. Did she tell you she was asking on my behalf? I finally said. That was certainly the impression I received. After the call ended, I sat quietly in my study. Rain tapped softly against the windows again, a familiar Oregon soundtrack. For several minutes, I stared at Daniel's photograph on my desk. Then I opened a drawer and removed a folder containing our original estate documents. I had not reviewed them in years. Life had simply continued, and I assumed everything remained in order. As I turned the pages, I realized how outdated many sections had become. Beneficiaries needed updating. Contact information was years old. Entire portions no longer reflected the reality of my life. That evening I called Harold and scheduled a meeting. Not because I intended to punish anyone. Not because I was angry. I simply wanted my affairs to reflect the truth rather than old assumptions. Word traveled faster than I expected. 2 days later, Ashley called. Her voice sounded strained. Mom, I heard you were meeting with Harold. I looked out at my backyard where fallen leaves covered the grass in shades of gold and red. Yes, I said calmly. There are some things I would like to review. Silence. Then another question. Why? It was such a simple word, yet it revealed so much. Not concern. Not curiosity about my well-being. Concern about something else entirely. For years I would have rushed to reassure her. This time I did not. Because it is my responsibility, I answered. The silence that followed felt different. Heavier. Ashley eventually ended the conversation, but something had changed. She could feel control slipping away. Meanwhile, for the first time in a very long time, I could feel it returning. And the more independent I became, the more desperate she seemed to understand exactly what I was planning. The meeting with Harold took place on a bright morning, nearly 6 weeks after my surgery. By then I was walking comfortably with only a cane, and each step felt like proof that healing was possible in more ways than one. Harold welcomed me into his office with the same kindness he had shown Daniel and me for years. We reviewed every document carefully. No pressure, no urgency, just facts. By the end of the afternoon, my affairs reflected the life I actually had rather than the assumptions everyone else had been making. As I left the office, I felt lighter than I had in a very long time. Not because of money, not because of paperwork, because for the first time in years, I was making decisions for myself. A few days later, Ashley appeared at my front door without calling. The moment I saw her expression, I knew she had learned something. She stepped inside and immediately began talking. Questions, concerns, explanations. She spoke so quickly that there was barely room for answers. Finally, she stopped and looked at me. Mom, why are you shutting me out? The question would have devastated me a few months earlier. Now it simply made me sad. I invited her to sit down. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The house felt different than it once had. Friends visited regularly now. Photographs had returned to their shelves. Fresh flowers sat on the kitchen table. Life had returned. Ashley, I said quietly, I am not shutting you out. She crossed her arms. Then why does everything feel different? I looked at her carefully. Because everything is different. She looked away first. I continued. For years I believed people had forgotten me. I believed friends stopped caring. I believed distance was normal. My voice remained calm. Then I discovered the letters. Silence filled the room. Ashley's face changed immediately. Not surprise. Recognition. She knew exactly what I meant. Mom, I was only trying to help. I nodded slowly. Maybe at first. Another silence followed. The kind that appears when excuses begin running out. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse her. I simply told the truth. I explained how much time had been lost. How many relationships had quietly disappeared. How often I had mistaken control for care. Tears appeared in Ashley's eyes. For the first time, she seemed smaller. Less certain. I thought you needed me, she whispered. I did need you, I replied. I just did not need to be isolated. Neither of us spoke for a long time after that. Some wounds do not heal in a single conversation. Some truths take years to fully understand. When Ashley finally left, there were no dramatic goodbyes. No promises. No arguments. Just a quiet understanding that things could not continue as they had before. Months passed. My recovery became complete. I reconnected with old friends. I joined community events again. Carol and I met for lunch every Thursday. Ethan remained a regular part of my life. Not because either of us owed the other anything, but because genuine friendships often survive where obligations fail. One evening I sat on my back porch watching the sun disappear behind the Oregon trees. The air was cool. The world felt peaceful. My phone rang. It was Ashley. This time I answered with a smile. We talked for nearly an hour. Not about money. Not about paperwork. Just life. The conversation was imperfect, but honest. When the call ended, I sat quietly and reflected on everything that had happened. The day I left the hospital, I thought I had been abandoned. I thought the most important person in my life had turned away from me. What I did not understand then was that sometimes the most painful moments uncover the most important truths. The people who truly care do not always share your last name. They are the ones who show up. They are the ones who stay. And sometimes, when one door quietly closes, another opens and leads you back to the life you were always meant to have.